kind introduction. Oh, we're recording. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Hugely appreciated. And just to give you a little bit of an intro to myself and how I came to study neurolinguistic programming. I have been in sales for over 20 years now, worked with some fantastic organizations. And it was about 14, 15 years ago now, I discovered neuro-linguistic programming. And the only way I can describe it is it's remarkable for the ability to be able to get you to understand how to use your brains properly. That's pretty much a great way to sum up exactly what it is. And I started up my company, One Up Coaching, coming up to 4.5, 5 years ago now. And very much so, interestingly, have huge amounts of experience working with specifically the Gen Z population. And your ability to be able to engage and inspire and create behavioral change in these people from a sales training perspective it's everything. And that's what we're here to talk about today, bridging the generational gap in the workplace with a specific on the Gen Z population from that perspective. But I'm going to start off with a bit of a question. And some of you got your cameras on, some of you haven't, but please feel free to speak out and interrupt me with any form of questions you have along the way. But I'm going to start off with a bit of a question. How many of you heard some type of version of this over the last couple of years in terms of people referring to Gen Z? So they can't go 5 minutes without checking their phone. They've got no attention span. They're addicted to social media. They need instant gratification. They don't know how to communicate face to face. They're pretty sensitive, and oh my gosh, don't they get offended by everything? They have so much focus on mental health. They complain too much about mental health. They want rewards without putting in the work. Oh gosh, they're a little bit entitled, aren't they? Don't they quit jobs easily? Some of them lack such resilience. They amazes me how much they spend so much time creating content than actually doing proper work. They're obsessed with online validation and likes. They just don't respect authority, do they? They can't handle criticism. They prioritize feelings over facts. They expect workplaces to adapt to them instead of adapting to workplaces. Now, what are we thoughts? And please educate me. What else have I missed out? There's got to be a few in there. Any show of hands with anyone who feels I've left anything dramatic out there? I think I've covered all of it quite a lot. Feel free to interrupt if so. But my thing here today is because today I'm going to suggest something that may feel slightly uncomfortable. What if Gen Z aren't the problem? What if we're looking at the wrong thing? Because throughout history, every generation has criticized the generation that came after them, right? You would have got it from your parents and your grandparents, oh, you younger generation, you're lazy, distracted, uncommitted, entitled. When we have a job, it's a job for life, you know? We've heard these versions of that story for hundreds of years, and yet somehow a society has still continued to function remarkably well, despite the facts and opinions of the generation before us. But I think something genuinely is different this time. Not because Gen Z are fundamentally different people, but because they're the first generation in human history where social and cognitive development was shaped by immersive digital technology. The first Gen Z people, as you know, were born in 1996, okay? And the internet was commercialized in 1995. They've never known a world without it. right? No smartphones wasn't in their childhood. Social media wasn't, no social media wasn't in their childhood. Google has always been available. No instant access wasn't in their childhood. That changes things dramatically. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Not necessarily just Gen Z, not millennials, not boomers, not labels. And that is where I think the NLP feeds into it. Today, what it's about understanding how the environment people grow up in shapes their communication, how they learn, how they build relationships, how they respond to leadership, and how they experience work. Because I believe one of the most important leadership capabilities over the next decades will be generational intelligence. Right? The ability to understand, the ability to empathize and communicate effectively across all age groups. Not because generations are the same and not because they're completely different, but because misunderstanding is becoming increasingly expensive. That's the thing. And, from having done various, hate to drop it, CIPD, accreditations over the years and various courses in management and management strategies and ideologies and all of this type of stuff, management in general is pretty broken, right? And many moons back, I studied um, um, all different types of management techniques, but absolutely nothing prepared me to be an HRD of a sales organization. Absolutely nothing. And it's something that I've had the pleasure of learning along the way. And over the years, I've also, as well, the general population of people that I'm predominantly training fall into that Gen Z category. And there are a couple of things which I think is quite poignant here. I tend to have a bit of a knack, and one of the reasons why clients engage me is my actual ability to be able to appeal to the greater nature of the Gen Z population. And for years, I couldn't quite decode what I did or what I do until I've been given various bits of feedback which have kind of crept up as patterns and commonalities over the years. And here are some of the common themes. So for me, transparency, transparency on everything. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of this has to be, financial data, but actually, so they feel like less cogs in a machine and more genuinely part of something. They don't want to be hidden from stuff. Authenticity as well, unashamedly yourself. They can smell BS if not, right? They can absolutely spot a faker a mile off. And somebody who is not or doesn't have authenticity and is genuinely themselves, it's very hard to buy into that. Also, as well, progression comes up, right? This elasticity. We live in a gig economy, don't we? Entrepreneurialism is at our fingertips all the time. We actually don't have to rely on our perm job just to make money anymore. But actually, if we're quashing that, then again, that's not going to appeal to the greater nature of, you just be holding people back. But then also, as well, the basic human need of feeling safe as well. Safety. And if we think about it, these things, based on these principles, I don't think any of them seem horrendous in any shape or form, right? For my 10-year-old boy that I've got, absolutely. Would I want those to be in his world? Well, yeah, of course I would. And these aren't principles in which we wouldn't want our children to grow up without, right? So over the next 90 minutes and potentially even less, we'll see how we go with time. We're going to be exploring exactly that, why digital natives are changing the rules of communication, and actually what neurolinguistic programming can teach us about understanding behaviour. Because, as I said, maybe Gen Z isn't changing work. Maybe work is just changing for everyone. So, I'll just give you a bit of an overview as to what NLP is to begin with. And again, please feel free to interrupt me if anyone has any thoughts or questions on anything. But neurolinguistic programming began its life in the early 1970s. John Grinder and Richard Bandler were the primary creators of NLP, both men who have actually certified me, one for my NLP practitioner and one for my master NLP practitioner. And both men had a fascination with human excellence, which almost charted the path for them to model behavioural patterns of selected geniuses. And actually, modelling is the core activity within NLP. So what is NLP? It's thinking about thinking. It's the study of human behavior. NLP is the practice of coding how people organize their thinking, language, and behavior to produce the results in which they do. Okay, so we'll just kind of look at some of those separately, because NLP didn't fall into one kind of perfect bracket, and neither did the methodologies and techniques fall perfectly into neuro linguistic and programming, but yet all three kind of act as useful umbrellas to introduce various topics within. But just looking at the neuro parts of NLP. What is a neuro part? So this is the use of our five senses to interpret the world around us. It's our brain. It's our neurology. It's the chemicals within our brain. And when we're talking about neurolinguistics, we're looking to create chemical changes in people. Because if we think about it, our body would be a little bit like a zombie, wouldn't it? If it didn't have instructions from the mind. If it didn't have instruction from the mind to tell it what to do. And if we think about it also as well, we have our traditional brain, but we also have our solar plexus, our kind of nervous brain from that perspective, which is in control of all of our fears, our emotions, our digestive system. And how the two brains communicate is through the spinal cord. But what's really, really interesting with the neuro part of NLP is that we look at how our thoughts and perceptions can then be decoded into the body, because something has to trigger the body into behaving that way. And that's what the neuro part explores. And when we think about it from a Gen Z perspective, the experiences that shape how we see the world. Gen Z are the first generation whose development was shaped by smartphones, shaped by social media, instant information, continuous feedback, digital communities. Their brains haven't simply adopted technology, they've developed alongside it. And that's a huge difference when it comes to the neuro part of things. When we talk about the linguistic part of NLP, we look about how language can create chemical changes. And when we talk about the language from an NLP perspective, it's not only the language in which we are received, but the language in which we also give, how we've decoded it from what's going on in your brain to what's coming out in your mouth, but also the language in which we have going round our heads, that either limiting, disenabling, or even enabling language that goes around and kind of lives rent-free in our heads on a daily basis. Because we then use language to describe what's going on within our heads. And the linguistic part of NLP bridges the gap between our minds and reality, doesn't it? Because language is our life. What we say is what we think and do. Communication when it comes to leadership is everything, absolutely everything. But what's really cool about NLP is when you listen to the way people structure their sentences, when we listen to the words in which they use, you can actually decode what's happening in their brain. So how useful will that be when you're trying to understand somebody from a different generational perspective? How they better piece their worlds together, how it enables you to better understand, and how they create their actions, which ultimately results in their programming. Because the language we use shapes the meaning we create. When a manager says to a Gen Z person, can we have a chat later? The manager hears, okay, quick conversation. The Gen Z person might think, Christ, am I in trouble? You know, it's the same words, different interpretation, different emotional response. And that's how why having NLP as an understanding enables you to be able to communicate in a way it will actually resonate with people, as opposed to, well, in this case, installs a fear of God into them. And when we look at programming, we run our lives in a similar way a computer does, that it uses a program to achieve a specific result. And the only way I can kind of give you an example on this is my son, Luca. So when Luca was born 10 years ago, let's just say his desktop on it, it might have had Microsoft Word, right? And it might have, had the ability to be able to download Excel, but he hadn't quite have downloaded it quite yet. And at the age of 10 now, he's got so much stuff on his desktop. He's got Teams, he's got Zooms, he's got these weird apps that he doesn't even know where they came from, but they're there. He's got Excel spreadsheets with hundreds of different tabs open. He's got pictures in his desktop, absolutely everything. Because if you're not born with it, you've learnt it. That's the thing. And if you've learnt it and you don't want it anymore, you can actually undo it, as long as you recognize that it's a program. A way to do that is to ask yourself, does everybody do it in the same way as me, or is it unique to me? And programming are the patterns and the behaviors that we repeat. Digital environments create powerful feedback loops, don't they? Notifications, likes, rankings, comments, instant access. These experiences influence expectations around feedback, progression, communication, responsiveness, leadership, the whole lot. And this is where NLP becomes incredibly powerful for leaders. Most people look at behavior. NLP asks, what created that behavior? The neuro part reminds us that our experiences shape how we interpret the world. Gen Z grew up in a completely different environment for most leaders, right, at the end of the day. The linguistic part reminds us that words don't have meaning. People create meaning from words. That's why two people can say exactly the same words, but have completely different emotional reactions to it. And the programming part reminds us that repeated experiences create patterns. When you've grown up with instant information, instant feedback, and continuous connection, it naturally shapes expectations in the work shape. That doesn't mean Gen Z are right in any shape or form, but it doesn't mean older generations are wrong either. It means they're operating from completely different maps of reality. And as NLP teaches us, there's a saying with NLP, the map is not the territory. What that means is that there is no such thing as reality, only our perception of it. And I think that's quite poignant, particularly in this situation. But, for actually most circumstances in life and actually most relationships from that perspective, there is no such thing as reality, only our perception of it. The leader's job isn't to judge the map. The leader's job is to understand it, right? And so a question that I got for you guys is, how many of the frustrations we attribute to Gen Z are actually a result of us not understanding the environment that shapes them? It's really something to consider. And that's usually where a discussion with yourself really starts to that. Has anyone got any questions on this slide, just out of interest? Please feel free to butt in. There are no silly questions, I promise you. All good? Okay, we'll continue. So, what can NLP teach us about leading digital natives? So, most people hear Neuro Linguistic Programming thinks, oh, well, that's manipulating people, isn't it? That's how you influence people. And actually, I think that's the wrong question. A far more useful question is, how do I understand the experience people are already having? Because where NLP becomes incredibly relevant to Gen Z is neither really about influence. they're about understanding how people create meaning, understanding the stories that people tell themselves, understanding the interpretation sitting beneath the behavior. Because people don't respond to reality, they respond to their interpretation of reality. And Gen Z may be interpreting the world very, very differently from the leaders managing them. If we think about it in terms of the bigger context, before we kind of take a deeper dive into NLP, we need to understand something important. Gen Z are the first digitally native generation in human history. I'll say that once, I'll say that twice. They don't know a world without smartphones, social media, immersive technology in any shape or form. Right? That's all they know. But the mistake many generations, many organizations make, if we look at that fish analogy within the corner here, many organizations make the mistake of looking at the fish. They focus on Gen Z. They analyze Gen Z. They try to fix Gen Z. Why are you the way you are? Why are you so entitled? Why do you need continuous feedback? Come on, buck up and get on with it. Yes, you've got to be in the office 5 days a week, just like I was, right? But they forget to look at the water. They forget to look at the environment they're in. They forget to look at the murky water they're surviving in this tiny fishbowl. They forget to look at the digital landscape. They forget to look at the social media context, because behavior makes much more sense when you understand the environment that it's shaped in. And that's where NLP becomes incredibly valuable when it comes to this. Here's a really, really interesting statistic that I think should make every HR leader pause for a second, that I came across, which I find a little bit terrifying actually. Only 6% of Gen Z say their primary career goal is to hold a leadership position. If we think about that from a people strategy perspective for 1 minute, right? It's quite alarming. Because most organizations are built on an assumption that future leaders will emerge from within the business, aren't they? That's ultimately the intention, to grow your own, isn't it? Unless, there is genuinely nobody. And that future leaders not only will emerge from the business, that talented people will naturally progress into leadership roles over time. But what if that assumption is becoming less true? This isn't because Gen Z lack ambition in any shape or form. I train hundreds and hundreds of Gen Z people, and they do not lack ambition one bit, right? In fact, many of them want growth, impact, influence, progression. But what they appear less interested in is the traditional version of leadership. It doesn't interest them. When younger employees look up, if they think about it, what do they see? They see stress. They see burnout. They see, messages coming from the board in which they just simply have to deliver down when they don't even believe in it or aren't even bought into it. And they just see messenger people from that perspective. They see back-to-back meetings. They see pressure. They see responsibility without autonomy, even though apparently you really do have it. And if that's the picture of leadership we're presenting, perhaps the real question isn't why don't they want leadership? Perhaps a better question is, have we made leadership attractive enough to want? Because if only 6% aspire to it today, who leads next from that perspective? I think that's a really concerning thing that we need to think about, and actually how we're kind of framing this and appealing to their greater nature. So what I want to do now is I want to take a little bit of a look into some of the key techniques within NLP, and stuff to really, really consider here when we're looking at how we can filter neuro-linguistic programming into understanding different generations' perspectives, specifically Gen Z. So, as we know, we mediate the world through our five senses, don't we? See, touch, taste, smell, and hear. And actually, we convert these senses into language, and we give these senses labels. if we think about the word emotion, it's just a label for a load of senses we're experiencing, isn't it? If we think about the word love as well as a label, love can mean and feel so different from one person to the next. But people get so caught up on the label, don't they? They use the label, but they don't sense it, they don't mean it. And this is an example of how we lose language, of how we delete and we distort and we generalize. But the five senses of how we experience the world. We don't experience reality directly. We experience reality obviously through these five senses, but NLP suggests that before we create meaning, before we make decisions, before we take action, information first enters through our senses. Now, what's the challenge with this? No two people experience the same situation in exactly the same way. Nobody from today will come away remembering and experiencing the same thing as one another. Yes, you've all received the exact same information, but you will all walk away with something different. Now, one of the foundational ideas of NLP is that we don't interact with reality directly. Everything we know about the world comes through our senses. We see things, we hear things, we feel things, we smell things. Our brain then processes that information and creates meaning from it. Now, here's where this becomes really relevant for leadership because, as we said, people can have the same experience, but walk away with completely different views on it. The event was the same, the interpretation wasn't. And that's because what we pay attention to differs. Now, some people focus on what was said, some focus on how they felt, other people focus on what they saw. This is why communication is so complex, and leaders often assume, I said it, therefore they've understood it, right? But understanding isn't created by what we say, it's created by how the other person experiences what we say. And this becomes even when we think about Gen Z because their sensory environment has been radically different from previous generations, right? Being, growing up with thousands of notifications, multiple screen, video first communication, short form content, continuous digital simulation, right? Their sensory world has been completely different. And if the inputs are different, the interpretation of the world may be different too, which means leadership isn't about changing people. It's about understanding how they're experiencing their world in the first place. People are either more visual, they're more auditory, or they're more kinesthetic. So they access their emotions. And if we don't understand how people experience their worlds, right? If we think about it, how many disagreements at work are actually caused by people having different experiences of the same events? It's so true, right? It's so true. And so understanding the five senses is no longer enough, right? It's about, again, I'll refer back to the murky fish water. We need to understand the sensory environment has been radically different from previous generations and what they've grown up with. And the interpretation of world will be different too from that perspective. Really, really important to understand. So, um, some of you will look at this and you would have seen various different iceberg pictures of over the years describing different things. And actually, when we look about this from a conscious and subconscious mind's perspective, I think this rings really, really true. And is really, really quite helpful for understanding actually what we can consciously see. Because leaders often manage what people say, but great leaders understand what drives it. Now, here, the NLP techniques that we adopt when we're looking to do NLP on individuals are actually aimed at the subconscious minds. And if we think about it, how do we know the difference? So right now you are maybe sat at your desk And right now, you're probably not aware, and you're probably not aware of the feel of the seats against your legs. But I bet you are now, though. It's always present. You're just not aware. And that's because it's sat in your unconscious or your subconscious minds. Right now, your subconscious mind is fighting antibodies. It's digesting your food. It's healing you. It's allowing you to breathe because you don't consciously breathe, do you? 90% of the things we do on a daily basis, we do unconsciously, right? We spend the majority of our day in our subconscious minds. We spend the majority of our day in a trance. And really, for this one, when it comes to our conscious minds, and we kind of reflect it back into, from a leaders often manage what people say, great leaders understand what drives it. When we look at the conscious minds, that's what people know. We know people's goals, we know people's decisions, we know people's opinions. This is all about logic, what they say. This is the tip of the iceberg. But actually, how often do we actually look at what drives that behavior? What's below the waterline? What about beliefs, values, identity, habits, fears, emotional experiences, motivations, assumptions, everything below the surface, which is arguably way more intrusive and important because people don't always behave according to what they say. They behave according to what they believe. One of the most useful concepts of NLP, I find, is the distinction between the conscious and the subconscious minds. The conscious mind is obviously what people are aware of, right? But beneath the surface sits something much bigger, far more vast. And this is where many leadership challenges live ultimately at the end of the day. If we kind of link it to Gen Z, if a Gen Z person might say, oh, I'm really looking for flexibility, a leader might hear, oh, I want to work from home. That's conscious communication. But underneath that might sit autonomy, trust, work-life integration, focus, control over their environment. And if we only respond to the request, miss the deeper needs, right? Another example might be, if a Gen Z employer says, oh, yeah, I don't want a leadership role. Most organizations stop there. But actually, NLP teaches us to get curious. What's underneath that statement? Do they think leadership means, well, all of those things I mentioned, stress, burnout, endless meeting, messenger people, politics? Because if that's their unconscious association with leadership, the issue isn't ambition. The issue is meaning. And this is why two people, can hear exactly the same message and respond completely differently. The conscious mind hears the words. The unconscious mind interprets meaning. When we think about it, digital natives, they've grown up in a completely different environment. Different experiences create different beliefs. Different beliefs create different interpretations, and different interpretations create different behaviors, don't they? So which means that if we want to lead Gen Z effectively, we need to understand not just what they're saying, but the meaning sitting beneath it. How often do we probe? How often do we how often do we explore the meaning behind the motivation or the motivation behind the motivation? Think about the last time, a Gen Z employee frustrated you. What did they say? More importantly, what belief might have been sitting underneath that? Very, very rarely do we explore the belief behind what people are saying because the future of leadership isn't understanding people's behavior. It's understanding the beliefs, meanings, and assumptions that create it. And actually, if you can get to the crux of that, we might have a way forward. But if we don't, it's kind of a bit of a pin in it, isn't it? We're kind of left with not many places to go from there. Any questions, guys, on this so far?
Naomi, I do have one in the chat from Suzanne, just saying it really
Oh, great.
interesting
Sorry,
stat.
my chat isn't coming up.
No,
Huge
it's fine. I
apology.
will keep my eyes on the chat. Don't worry.
Thank you so
So
much.
interesting stat, read the 6% of Gen Z wanting leadership roles. Can I ask where the source data is from?
Do you know what? I actually can't remember. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm going to have to come back to you on that one. Let me come back to you if that's okay. Um, I've got a feeling I pulled it off of LinkedIn a little while ago now. But is it okay if I get that back to you? Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. This is Suzanne. I'm eating my
No,
lunch at the same time, which is why I'm not on screen,
good for
and
you.
popping questions in. And I thought I'd better know what I'm talking about before I start quoting that stat.
Yeah, no. And actually, what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to send you a LinkedIn profile of a chap that actually specializes within this. And I actually believe that he did a talk on it as well. I've got a feeling he did a really good TED talk, which you might benefit from, actually based on that stat as well. So I'll happily send that across to you.
Awesome. Thanks very much.
Just
Okay.
one more as well. So from Alice, she said also, do you know what percentage of other groups say that they want leadership roles? For example, Gen X.
I don't, unfortunately. But that would be very, very interesting to find out the generational differences within that, without a question of a doubt. Yeah, I don't, unfortunately. I would be making that up.
Fab. I think that's all in the chat for now. I'll keep you posted.
All good. Keep me posted. Please do. Please do. Okay. So, what is this wonderful image in front of you? Crikey. Well, this is how human beings add meaning to everything, right? This is how we add meaning to everything. So we match an experience to a past representation where we've made judgments on that past experience. We use old patterns to recall how we felt. We put language on top of it all. And this is our linguistic map of the world, right? We filter reality. We delete. We distort. We generalize. We don't experience life objectively. We experience our version of it, don't we? You know? And those internal representations, they create a state. And it's our state in which drives behavior. It's our state in which drives behavior. So if we think about it, the event is the same, the interpretation isn't, is it? One of the most useful ideas, I think, in NLP is that nobody experiences reality directly. We experience reality through our filters, right? Every conversation, every meeting, every piece of feedback, every decision first passes through a set of filters before it becomes meaning. And when we think about how we determine our linguistic map, it's very much so based on our beliefs and our values, right? Very much so based on our beliefs and our values. And these beliefs and values are defined by the people around you. The culture in which we were brought up in, our religion, the era in which we were brought up in, our family system, you know. If we think about it, that determines. Oh my gosh, my ex-mother-in-law used to drive me absolutely potty with her no food waste value. She literally couldn't waste anything. She'd come around for a Sunday roast, and I'd have about 10 million and two pots of one spoonful of cauliflower cheese left in the fridge, But she grew up during the war where food was scarce. So that value has been installed into her. If we think about it, criminal families, the Cray brothers, that's all they know from that perspective. But you have choice whether to accept or reject these values. We learn this stuff. If we think about it, we've got rules in life and we don't even know where they came from. There's no evidence of where they came from. But every decision you make, every word we speak, every action we take is driven by our beliefs and values from that perspective. It's a really, really interesting thought, because this is why modern leadership is becoming less about communication and more about interpretation. The question isn't, what did I say? The question is, what meaning did they create from what I say? Because the meaning of your communication is the response in which you get at the end of the day, if we think about it. If we kind of look at a couple, at an example here, if we think about an external event, the event itself can be neutral, right? But let's just say, oh my gosh, I got one of these once. I got a message on Teams from my manager saying, "Can we catch up later?" That's an event, isn't it? Nothing more. Now, what could happen is can we catch up later on Teams? That event can now pass through somebody's filters, their beliefs, their values, their past representations, their experiences, their tragic memories, their assumptions. And this is where Gen Z becomes interesting, because many of their filters were formed in a completely different environment, weren't they? We know the environments in which they were brought up in. And so when it goes through their filter, they might think, "Oh Christ, have I done something wrong here?" The same events, different filters, different meaning. When the manager was literally like, "Can we catch up later?" If we think about the internal representation that has, NLP calls this an internal representation because this is the story we create, the meaning we attach, the pictures we build in our minds. And here's the important part. People don't react to the events. They react to the story. And the story creates a state, whether that's confidence or anxiousness or defensiveness or concern. And that state changes everything. And what's a subsequent behavior? Well, the behavior is simply the outcome. If I believe that my manager is unhappy with me, I'm going to behave differently. But if I believe my manager wants my opinion, I also will behave differently. The behavior isn't the problem. The interpretation created the behavior, right? And this is where it's becoming less about communication and more about interpretation. We think about it. Gen Z aren't responding to different workplace. They're responding to the same workplace through a way different set of filters through us. Our values, our beliefs, our the era in which we brought up in. We're just kind of filtering our experience through life through a completely different set of filters. But naturally, then that will have an internal representation, which will affect the state, which will then affect the physiology, which will then impact how it is out to the world and the way in which we behaved. This is our map of the world, and this is why leaders in Gen Z can experience the same events and arrive at completely different in conclusions from one another. One really, really useful idea within NLP is that also people tend to pay attention to different types of information. Some people focus on what they see, others on what they hear, and some focus on what they experience. And whether or not we believe people fit neatly into these categories kind of isn't really the point. The leadership lesson is not everyone receives information in the same way. Now, this becomes particularly relevant when we think about if people who are born in a digital native era. Many of us grew up consuming information in a fairly linear way, right? Kind of one channel at a time, wasn't it? Might be a conversation, might be a book, might be a TV program, which turns out that most of them seem to be quite dodgy now. Now we cut back on it. But Gen Z grew up quite differently. They think about what happened when a teenager is kind of sitting on a sofa today. Even with my 10-year-old, it petrifies me. They're kind of watching a video. They're messaging friends. They might be listening to music. They're kind of scrolling through social media, receiving notifications, and all at the same time. It's mad, right? Now, what's the implication here? The result is that communication preferences can look very different because traditional leadership often relies heavy on things like meetings, doesn't it? Emails, presentations, But digital natives are often consuming information through video, visual content in kind of short snippets, short bursts, or collaborative discussion or interactive experiences. The expectation isn't necessarily different content, but it's different delivery. And for, in terms of what I think Gen Z are asking for, they're not asking for more. They're just asking for different. The same message, but delivered differently in a way in which they know, in a way in which they can engage with, in a way in which resonates with them, in a way in which they grew up with. Because let's just imagine if I delivered one of my training sessions, and I may be explaining a new process. If I delivered a 40-slide PowerPoint and, a 60-minute presentation with zero interaction, it's kind of like, an information dump, I'm going to lose people dramatically. Whereas if I had something which was a visual demonstration, a discussion, maybe a real world scenario, maybe an opportunity to contribute, you've got to ask which one creates more engagement. It's going to be the second. Not just for Gen Z though, but actually for most people, right? Because communication is delivered, connection is felt. The goal isn't to communicate more, the goal is to communicate in a way in which is easier for people to engage with. And if we think about it, how many of your communication methods were designed around how leaders prefer to receive information themselves rather than how employees prefer to engage with it? That usually generates quite a lot of discussion from that perspective, but it's such a poignant thought because the future isn't about speaking louder and doing things in the way in which we always knew. It's about communicating in a way that people can actually connect with. Yes, somebody is going to maybe be a little bit more visual. I am visual kinesthetic to its bone. I'm not auditory in any shape or form. Some of you might lean towards more auditory. Others may access their feelings more on a daily basis. And yes, you can change your language to appeal to their greater nature. But when we're thinking about it from a Gen Z perspective, it is so much deeper than just this. How you communicate is going to be everything of your ability to be able to, one, get them on board, but also then to create the behavioural change, which is ultimately going to move the organisation forward. Super, super important. So just to explore the neuro part of this, it's quite an interesting one. Our brain responds to meaning, not just reality. If we all just kind of close our eyes for a moment, this is quite a nice thought. Imagine if it's 4:45 on a Friday afternoon. That'd be lovely, wouldn't it? You've had a busy week, your phone buzzes, and you look down and you see that message, from your manager. Can we have a quick chat on a Monday morning? That's it. No context. No explanation. No emoji. Oh my God, there's not an emoji on there. That must mean something serious. Can we have a chat on a Monday morning? Crikey. Now, what happens when we look at that message? I don't know about you, but my heart rate changes. I feel tense. I start creating all of these eventualities and these stories in my head. Did your brain start looking for evidence? Christ, what did I do this week? What did I do wrong? I must be in trouble. There's got to be bad news. What's the NLP learning here? The message itself is neutral, but the response isn't. The brain immediately creates meaning, and that meaning creates emotion, and the emotion creates physiology, and physiology influences behavior. That's it. That's how humans work. It links directly to all of these things. Links directly to NLP, internal representation, meaning making, your conscious, unconscious minds, right? All in one example, right? And this demonstrates one of the most important ideas. Humans don't respond to events, we respond to our interpretation of events. That message is neutral, yet most people experienced a physiological reaction because the brain hates ambiguity. When information's missing, you fill in the gaps, don't you? I'm the absolute worst for this, without question of a doubt. Especially with one might catastrophize on things. We fill them with protective stories, and this is especially relevant for Gen Z, right? Many Gen Z employees have grown up in environments with constant communication, instantaneous feedback, continuous connection. And when communication is unclear, the brain starts searching for meaning, and that meaning can very, very quickly become anxiety. What's the lesson here? Communicate more, right? Communicate more clearly, because people don't respond to what you intended. They respond to the meaning that they've created. If we think about it, how many workplace problems begin with a communication issue? Unbelievable amounts, and become a relationship issue because the story someone creates afterwards. But just, stuff like this just ends up being, you become a victim of your own circumstance from that perspective. Sam, have I got any questions that are kind of looming? Do we know, or am I good to
Nothing
continue?
else, but Alice did manage to find the survey where the 6% data came from, so she's popped
Wonderful.
that. Yes.
Good, I'm not making it up. Yay! Always a bonus. Woohoo!
But no more questions.
Okay, good. I'll continue. So, language is probably my most favorite part, okay, when it comes to NLP. Super, super important. People don't respond to our intentions. They respond to the meaning they create from our words. Language is probably the most visible part of NLP because the words in which we choose shape how people think, how they feel, but also how they respond. And this becomes incredibly important when we're leading across generations, because the same sentence can create completely different meanings for different people, right? If you get some feedback from your manager and they say, oh yeah, you need to be more resilient, the intention might be positive, but what might that Gen Z employee hear? Stop talking about your challenges. Get over it. Go figure it out for yourself. Your concerns aren't valid. Same words, different meaning. A leader might say, oh, why haven't you finished this yet? What emotion does that create? Pressure, defensiveness, protection. But now we compare it to, out of interest, what's making this difficult for you right now? Same issue, but different language, different emotional response, different conversation. And this is particularly relevant for Gen Z because they've grown up in an environment where language is constantly being interpreted. If we think about it, how much language gets lost in text messages? Oh my God, and WhatsApp messages. Someone can go to write a WhatsApp message in a really positive way, but the other person on the receiving end hears it in a total different manner. It's happening every single day. Texts, messages, comments, posts, notification. Digital communication totally removes tone. It totally removes context, and it totally removes body language. Over 90% of your ability to be able to communicate lies outside of the spoken words, right? Which means people become highly sensitive to wording. It's wild. We're missing out on so much communication. And one of the most important things that we need to ask ourselves is, am I communicating my intention, or am I communicating in a way that creates the meaning I want? Because those aren't always the same thing, right? We think about it. Which creates more in out of these examples, which creates more engagement? You need to improve, or what would success look like for you here? It's the same objective, but a completely different conversation. And what the future of this is will really belong to those who can communicate with clarity, curiosity, maybe a bit of empathy thrown in there, because language doesn't just describe reality, it helps create it at the end of the day. Transparency is everything when it comes to it. Right? And I think this is really, really important. Language and word choice for manager's primary tool. Use wisely. Sound guidance can grow from seeds of aligned words. Use poorly, and all you get are weeds. So true. But as I said, language, it's not just about the receiving of language, but also, and the giving of language, but also the language which goes around in our heads on a daily basis. We have a belief cycle, right? The behavior you see is often the result of a belief you don't. And what a really, really useful concept with NLP is that behavior rarely appears out of nowhere. It usually follows a cycle. Beliefs create thoughts, thoughts influence behavior, and behavior creates outcomes. And those outcomes reinforce beliefs, and then the cycle repeats again and again and again and again and again. So let's just take an example. Let's just say you've got a young employee coming in your organization, and they're told, oh yeah, we invest heavily in development. We've got a great L&D team here. I hear this all the time, which is why I end up coming into organizations. And their belief of that Gen Z person will be, oh, this organization is going to really help me grow, because actually we know that one of the key motivators to Gen Z are their ability to be able to grow, the ability to be able to learn. Right. And so they will have the thoughts, oh, I'm going to have opportunities here. My future matters. My manager's invested in me, and their behavior will be engaged, they'll be curious, they'll have an always be learning mindset, they'll probably contribute to ideas, they might volunteer for projects, they might even take a bit of ownership, and actually the outcome from that perspective would be a positive experience, right? Development opportunities, maybe recognition or growth, right? And the reinforced belief would be, this is somewhere where I can grow my career, and the cycle strengthens. But then if we flip it, right, and they join, and they're promised development, but 6 months later, they've got no feedback, which they just continually need, they've got no progression conversations, no coaching, no opportunities, and the belief is that growth really isn't a priority here. And then you think, well, why should I go the extra mile? Nobody kind of notices anyway. Maybe I need to just leave to develop. Maybe that will be easier. And so then what's the subsequent behavior? Disengagement, probably a reduction in efforts. Maybe they're kind of like quietly quitting in the corner, or kind of like looking for jobs on LinkedIn at lunchtime. And then what happens as a result of the outcome? Well, their performance drops, the manager becomes infuriated, and whoop, there we go, retention's kind of done again. And then the reinforced belief is this organization doesn't invest in people, and the cycle strengthens again. So many organizations focus on the behavior, the disengagement, the job hopping, the lack of commitment. But actually with NLP, it encourages us to kind of look one step further, or one step earlier even. What belief might be creating that behavior, And this is where that interesting, I'll go back to it, 6% of Gen Z say their primary career goal is not a leadership position, right? What belief is creating that? Because if the belief is negative, the behavior makes perfect sense. We've got to think, what beliefs about work, leadership, or development might your organization be unintentionally creating each day? Because if we want different behaviors, we kind of need to start creating different beliefs. don't we? We've kind of got to go back a step. We've got to go earlier. But yet we focus so much on the behaviour. We try to change behaviour. Why are you like that? You know, be different. What beliefs are creating that? That's kind of the more poignant thought. To touch upon the programming side of NLP, we don't see the code, right? We only see the outputs. We think about, you know, as I said, we run our lives in a similar way that a computer does, don't we, in order to achieve a specific result, right? I gave my son as an example. And if we think it like the computer, you know, we've got input, we've got programming, and then we've got output. Let's just take kind of like the input of life here, of Gen Z. Smartphones, instant access, algorithms, they're always quite insightful, trust me. Constant comparison, notifications, oh my God, constant comparison. Mad. Social validation, awful. How do we program that? The brain learns that speed is normal. Feedback is ruddy well expected continuously. What do you mean you can't give me feedback? What do you mean? I've been in the job 2 days. How well am I doing? What do you mean? I need feedback, right? Relevance matters. Information has to be instantaneous. Choice is unlimited. But what output does this have? Well, at work, this becomes, yes, they do want regular feedback. Questions, slow progressions, right? Challenges, outdated processes. They expect transparency. They seek meaning and purpose. And what leaders often call entitlements actually may simply be programming. And this is where NLP becomes particularly useful, because programming is simply the patterns we develop through repeated experiences, aren't they? Nobody consciously decides, I'd like and expect instantaneous feedback. We don't just decide that. We learn this stuff. We've learned it along the way. Repeated experiences become expectations. Expectations become beliefs. Beliefs become behaviour. If we think about it, how many people here use Amazon? I assume everybody, right? And how many people become frustrated when that next day delivery comes in 2 days' time? Riles me. But that's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm pretty sure that 15 years ago even, that we would have been delighted if something came 2 days later, you know? But nothing's changed about us, but the environment has. And the environment programmed a new expectation, you know? Now imagine being born in that environment. Imagine never knowing a world without Google, YouTube, Instagram, Netflix, Amazon, Spotify. That's not technology use. That's developmental conditioning. And when leaders say, oh, Gen Z they want too much feedback, it's doing my head in, I often wonder, like, compared to what? Compared to a generation raised with annual appraisals, do you remember? Annual appraisals, you know? Or compared to a generation raised with real-time feedback loops every day of their lives. Because the big question here, like, kind of like, is it entitlement or is it conditioning? Got to think about that. Is it entitlement or is it conditioning? It really helps reframe things quite nicely, I tend to find. Well, one thing within NLP was based on communication types. And there was this lady called Virginia Satir. Some of you might have heard of her. She was often referred to as the mother of family therapy. And she identified a fascinating pattern in human communication. She observed that when people feel safe and confident, communication tends to be open, honest, and maybe a little bit more authentic. But when stress, pressure, or uncertainty increase, people often default into one of these predictable communication styles. And they are the placator, the blamer, the computer, and the distractor. And at the center sits the congruent communication, somebody who is authentic, balanced, and emotionally intelligent. But just look at the placator. If if a Gen Z is a placator, they might just go, oh, yeah, I agree. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. They're kind of avoidant, super people pleasing, unwilling to challenge. And the reality of it is that they probably fear conflict, fear of negative judgment, desire to belong, right? Whereas a blamer is, someone needs to take responsibility for this, they might say. And actually, managers might appear, critical, controlling, micromanaging. But actually, the reality of it is that they might be feeling the pressure, you know? They might be feeling huge amounts of accountability or have performance concerns. Whereas the computer, someone might say, we need to stick to the facts here. Gen Z may experience maybe a lack of empathy, cold communication. They might feel unheard from that perspective. Whereas a distractor, I tend to come across a lot of these within the sales industry. Trust me, is let's just talk about something else. It kind of shows up as deflection, humor, changing the subject, maybe a bit of disengagement. Often masks discomfort or uncertainty. But one of the challenges that we face when discussing generations is that we assume communication problems are caused by age. Actually, usually, not only are they caused by our various filters and how we receive communication, our own internal map of the world, but they're usually also caused by stress, right? Because under pressure, people tend to fall into predictable communication patterns. One of these four. And Virginia Satir identified these, and for me, they're still really incredibly relevant today. Let's kind of link it to a Gen Z. Let's say, I don't know, a manager says, oh, Gen Z people, they don't speak up. I kind of often wonder whether we're seeing a generation issue or a communication issue here, because many young employees don't enter organizations with the same level of confidence or psychological safety as senior leaders, right? And under pressure, they'll most likely become placators because agreeing externally, disagreeing internally, naturally they're going to be that way, right? Another example could be if a manager says, has anyone got any questions? And the employee says no. The manager thinks, oh great, we're aligned. But the employee might be thinking, oh my God, I didn't understand any of this. That's not a capability problem. That's a communication problem. And this is particularly important for us because we got to think, which communication style do you as individuals default to when under pressure? Do you become a placator? Do you become a blamer? Right? Donald Trump, perfect example of a blamer. Computer, oh my gosh, I've completely forgotten his name. That's massively embarrassing that I've completely forgotten his name. I'm going to have to get that out to people. Do you become more of a computer when under stress? Or do you become a distractor? Ronald Reagan, he was a classic distractor when it came to acting under stress. Because most people immediately recognize themselves in one of these. And the goal of good leadership isn't perfect communication. It's congruent communication, creating an environment where people feel safe enough to be honest from that perspective, right? It's really, really something to think about of what we tend to fall into. Now, one thing I just want to end on is that one of the most important concepts of NLP is rapport. Rapport is simply the ability to be able to create trust, connection, and psychological safety with another person. And here's a challenge, right? Most leaders try to lead before they've built rapport. Most managers try to solve before they've understood. But organizations try to change behavior before they've created the connection as well. It's wild, isn't it? And what's the result of that? Well, naturally, you're going to get resistance. You're going to get defensiveness. You're going to get disengagement. I would never dream of walking into a training session and boom, delivering a training session with a bunch of Gen Z consultants without having a rapport for them. They're probably thinking to themselves, who the hell is she? I don't know anything about her. Got no context. How do I know if she's being authentic? You know, it's literally the worst possible decision I could ever make, doing that without having rapport with them. And because I'm going to get disengagement right from the start. But what NLP teaches us is something incredibly simple. People are far more willing to listen once they feel understood. And this becomes even more important when you're talking about Gen Z, because younger employees, they aren't looking for a boss. They're looking for someone who understands their world, not someone who agrees with everything, not someone who lowers standards, but someone who understands. And that's where rapport building becomes quite critical when managing Gen Z. Now listen, there are a few things on here in which you guys would have heard of: matching and mirroring. Now, this is probably the most understood NLP technique, because many people hear mirroring and think, oh, I'm supposed to copy someone and be exactly the same as somebody. That's not the point. And they're probably gonna, Gen Z people will think, why are you trying to be cool, or why are you making a plonker out for yourself? Actually, that's not the point. Good matching and mirroring isn't about imitation. It's about creating familiarity, right? It's about showing, I'm with you. For example, if somebody's speaking calmly and thoughtfully, and you immediately come in with high energy, I want to be cool, Gen Z, you know, energy, intensity, it actually can feel quite jarring, can't it? But if someone is talking through a concern and you instantly jump into problem solving mode, it's going to make someone feel unheard. Matching means adapting your communication style enough that the other person feels uncomfortable. The key word here is subtle. The goal isn't to become them. The goal is to reduce unnecessary friction, if we see what I mean. Pacing means meeting someone where they're psychologically, where they are psychologically before trying to move them somewhere else, right? This again, pacing and leading are really, really powerful leadership skills from that perspective. You know, just an example. You know, you might have a Gen Z person who thinks, well, annual reviews aren't going to be enough, are they? You know, and a traditional response might be, well, that's the process. We have reviews annually or quarterly. And you know, an NLP response would be, well, I can understand why that might feel a little infrequent to you. Notice something, right? You haven't agreed, but you haven't disagreed. You've simply acknowledged their reality. And at that time and that moment, someone feels understood. Resistance drops. That's what pacing is, right? But leading comes after pacing, not before, mind. Very much so, not before. Many managers try to lead immediately, but influence without rapport often feels like control to Gen Z people. And once someone feels understood, you can then begin guiding the conversation. Now you're leading, not forcing, guiding. That order matters. Pace first and lead seconds. Following as well. Following is one of the most underrated leadership skills. Sometimes the best thing a leader can do is allow the other person to lead the conversation. Many managers feel pressed to have all the answers, but people often don't need the answers first. I just want to be heard, you know? Tell me more. What else? You know? Help me understand that. What does that mean for you personally? Following demonstrates curiosity And curiosity creates trust. We know what it's like. If you haven't got trust, you've got nothing. And trust then creates influence. It's really what's missing. Mismatching as well. Most of the time we want rapport, but sometimes we deliberately break the pattern. That's mismatching. For example, someone enters a conversation highly emotional, reactive. If you match that emotional intensity, the situation escalates. Instead, if you deliberately slow the pace, lower your voice, reduce the intensity, ask calmer questions, you are intentionally creating a different state. That's mismatching. And actually used well, it can completely change the direction of a difficult conversation. Really, really important. So many people think mismatching is kind of like folding your arms and being like that. It's not. If you use it well, it can be quite powerful. But the mistake many organizations make is trying to influence before they understand. Gen Z don't respond particularly well to, well, because I said so, right? That's just how we do it here. It's process. Most people don't know, do they? What people respond to is, yeah, I understand. I hear you. Or then let's move forward together. That's rapport. And in many ways, rapport is this huge foundational piece that is ever so important to getting Gen Z on your side. And I know that better than anyone from a sales training perspective, that if I did not have rapport from these individuals, I'm going to get nothing out of them. It's literally going to be one ear out the next. Because I think we are entering one of the most really interesting periods in leadership history, right? Because for decades, leadership had largely been about the same assumptions, right? That we're supposed to have all the answers, information flows from the top down, and I am the messenger for that. Experience equals authority. Presence equals, oh, I'm here, I must be here all the time. Presence equals productivity. Control equals performance. And actually, for a long time, I grew up in a sales environment 20 years ago, it kind of worked for a bit. But that environment's massively changed. And when the environment changes, leadership has to change with it. For the first time in history, we're managing people who grew up in a fundamentally different world. And that's going to continue if we think about it. Crikey, not a slightly different world, a fundamentally different world. Previous generations adapted to technology. We've adapted to it. Gen Z have been shaped by it. That is a huge distinction. Leadership used to be about access to information. 20 years ago, managers often knew things that their teams didn't. Today, well, I'm not trying to be funny, but you can answer that. ChatGPT can answer that for you. They can watch a YouTube video on it. They can listen to a podcast on it. They can have that information like that, right? So the information is no longer the differentiator. So if information is no longer the differentiator, what is? So I think the new leadership advantage here is that I believe the future belongs to leaders who can create clarity, right? In a world where we are in information overload. Information absolute overload. I also think connection is everything in a world of digital communication. Actually, what we're longing for is connection. Also meaning in a world of constant distraction, and trust in a world where people question everything. They question everything. We're driven by trust more than ever, particularly as a result of post-COVID, particularly as the state of the world in which we're living in, let's face it, right? And also links to that psychological safety in a world that often creates this untold amounts of anxiety and uncertainty. And this is a question I think every HR leader should be asking. Are we preparing people for future work? or are we training them for the past? Because many organisations are still leading people as if they're managing in a workplace from 2005. And that is so true. You know, the workforce has changed, the environment's changed, expectations have changed. Tech is changing on a weekly basis. Leadership, it has to evolve too. And that's statistics. And perhaps, you know, nowhere is that more visible than in our next generation of leaders, right? Challenge isn't simply succession planning. The challenge is making leadership worth aspiring to again. Because the future of leadership isn't about getting the next generation to think like us. It's about understanding how the world has shaped them and adapting how we lead accordingly. It's going to be super, super important. Everyone, it's been so wonderful to share that with you. And I'd like to, we've got a huge apologies for only leaving a short period of time, but hopefully that you would have had questions coming through. Has anybody got any answers or, sorry, not any answers, any questions in which they'd like to ask based on what we've been through? Any thoughts, any feedback?
Not or anything yet? No?
All good?
I think everyone's suitably wowed.
Okay, wonderful. Listen, it was so wonderful to share this with you today, and thank you so much for joining. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. It's Naomi Williams and my company's One Up Coaching. And if you have any questions or you'd have any thoughts on anything, I absolutely welcome any thoughts on that, and would happily answer any questions in which you have offline. But it's been a pleasure to share this with you today, and look forward to connecting with you.
Lovely, amazing. Guys, I will share the recording with you all, and also Naomi's LinkedIn information and everything for you as well. But thank you so much, Naomi. That was amazing. And thank you for attending, everyone.
Thanks so much. I'll see you later.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.